All right, well, let me go ahead and get started. Patrick is on his way in, and I'm sure more folks will be trickling in from the waiting room as we talk. Um, in case anyone has not already heard me, hey, Patrick,
Hey.
glad you're here. Um, if anyone has not already heard me say, we're changing our display name on Zoom. If you hover over your face, if you're on a computer, those three little dots, you should be able to rename yourself, your name and the program that you're coming from. And if you would chat in the chat function, your name and program and email address, that's how we will be taking attendance. And just a quick policy reminder from Episcopal Charities that we do these Sustainability Institutes about once a month, and we ask programs to attend 3 virtual or 1 in-person and 2 virtual when in-person resumes throughout the course of the year. So thank you all so much for being here. We are also recording this session, so everyone say hello to program directors of the future watching. So if you don't want to be on camera, feel free to turn your video off, just so you know. We've changed our names, we've done the chat thing. Please keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. Do speak and feel free to interrupt me at any point. But if you would keep yourself muted when you're not, so we could minimize background, that would be awesome. And finally, our last little housekeeping thing is just to be sure to use the chat function today as much as you would like to be as another way of sort of participating. We've got the chat function. We also have those fun little emoji reacts that you can throw up. You're also welcome to take yourself off mute and be talking. So just want you all to know that be participative, and I want this to be as much of a discussion as possible. Thank you, Patrick. Look at that thumbs up. So before I get started here with my PowerPoint, actually, no, I should get that up first. Give me one moment. I have to do the share screen thing. Make co-host.
I see everyone was able to put their program next to their name, but where do I find to do that?
If you hover over your little box where your face is, if you're on a laptop, a computer, those 3 little dots next to mute, there should be a rename drop down.
Okay, thank you.
Sure thing. Okay. Excellent. So our format of our time together today is we're going to start and just sort of lay some groundwork, define some terms about volunteer orientation. And then what I'm actually going to do is just sort of dive into the orientation PowerPoint that I use every month at Episcopal Charities for our volunteer orientation as kind of an example of what you might look at for shaping your own volunteer orientation. So let me get my notes all caught up here. And just so you all know also, the resources that I am pulling from today are, there's a volunteer engagement book. It's like a hard copy book through Volunteer Match, which is awesome. I look at it all the time, and I think Patrick has an Amazon link to drop in the chat here. That's a great resource. And again, that's through Volunteer Match. And Volunteer Match is also an excellent resource for volunteer management stuff. They do webinars pretty frequently and have lots of videos and resources on their website as well. And then I also pulled from New York Cares has a really fabulous volunteer management handbook that's available on the internet as a PDF. And so that is linked in the resources for today's session on our website on the EC page. Whoops, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. All right, so first of all, want to spend a minute talking about why it's important to even do a volunteer orientation at all, right? Um, so the thing about orientations is that it's like the one time that you have this intentional block of time one-on-one with your volunteers. And so my hope is that this conversation can help us to think about how to best use that limited time to sort of set the groundwork for how we work with volunteers moving forward. So, orientation is often sort of the first contact point that volunteers have with you, and really sets the stage for their experience at your program or with your organization. We all obviously know that first impressions are important, and that folks want to feel welcomed at your program, and that you want and frankly need them to be there, right? So by setting these expectations through this process and communicating your policies, you're also able to keep your other volunteers, your staff, and the guests or clients or students that you work with safe. It sets expectations for the processes that volunteers really need to know about and what they'll be expected to do while they're working with you on site. Lays the groundwork for how volunteers behave and conduct themselves, and how you all kind of treat yourselves as a community. And again, it's this dedicated time that you get to tell your story to your volunteers, right? And this is really central. We're really busy with the work that we're doing, and we don't always have the opportunity to kind of sit down and pause and talk about the incredible work that you are all doing with people who care about it and want to get involved with it, right? It really is like an exciting opportunity. So think of volunteer orientations as community outreach work, right? You are educating prospective community members about why it matters that they stick with you and keep doing this work with you. It's really important for them to understand kind of the story of what you do and why you do it, and how volunteers are crucial to that work. That's what makes people want to keep coming back, right? Which leads me to my final point, which is retention. Studies on volunteer management have shown that programs that do formal orientations and have more rigorous sort of onboarding processes for volunteers tend to have volunteers stick around more. So it's a great way to get folks sort of invested in what you're doing. And these are some kind of bullets of things that your orientation should accomplish broadly. So create familiarity with your program's history and mission. You're telling your story. People are familiar with the work that you're doing. And more importantly, even an understanding of how volunteers contribute to that work specifically. What is the stuff that they are going to be doing that's so important to the core of who you are as an organization or program? Logistically, basically communicating expectations, policies, and next steps for volunteers, of course. And finally, to foster this open environment where folks are open and able to share feedback and concerns with you on an ongoing basis, really setting the stage for that with your orientation. And just a quick note about the scale and range of this conversation, because I know that there are a lot of formats that we could be using for volunteer orientations, whether we're doing these virtually or in person. I would do a quick plug for Zoom for volunteer orientations. It has been really awesome for this. For us, and I find can be a little bit less intimidating for new volunteers to kind of log on to a Zoom call rather than venturing to a new place. And if you have the capacity to, for example, set a recurring Zoom meeting that says, this is the time every month that I meet with new volunteers, that's a great way to use technology for this. And there's also a variety, in terms of scale that we could be having these conversations on, because we're talking specifically here about kind of formal orientation sessions. But we also know those days where you have a group of volunteers that's just coming in just for the day and you have like 10 minutes to tell them what the deal is before they need to start working. Or you have a individual volunteer who shows up day of and is brand new and you need to kind of crash course and get them ready to go. So again, we'll look at our Episcopal Charities PowerPoint that's kind of longer and more formal, because I think it is important to do these like formal sessions. But I also want to say that I think we can and should keep in mind that these ideas that we'll be talking about can kind of translate to different scales and settings depending on what the situation is. So regardless of setting, I just want to emphasize this image here that all of these pieces, whether you are having an hour and a half evening orientation session, or you're just chit-chatting with 4 new volunteers who just showed up that day, that all of these communications sort of come out of your mission and strategic plan. The why and the how of what you're doing is really important to communicate to volunteers, just for transparency and for to get them again invested in your community. So let me pause there real quick and see if there are any comments or questions before I jump on into this Episcopal Charities PowerPoint. Excellent. Thank you for the opportunity to drink some water there. So now we can take a look at Episcopal Charities. This is our volunteer PowerPoint, again, that I use every month. And the first thing that I do with a group of new volunteers is an icebreaker. And I always love to sort of build in icebreakers and community builders right from the beginning. And so you can do that with a round robin question. You can do that through Zoom chat. There are a lot of ways to do it to sort of just make people feel comfortable. My kind of go-to icebreaker questions is I have people share their name and their pronouns and their quarantine MVPs, or like the things that have been getting them through the pandemic. So mine are my dog and Desperate Housewives. And I just find that people like to share the things that they've been doing in this really intense year that we've all had together, but really isolated, and to kind of break the ice that way, I found is helpful. And here's the agenda that I use. So this is obviously sort of the skeleton for the session together, but for you all, it might be kind of a helpful just sort of checklist in terms of things to include in your orientation. So I'll do the introduction to Episcopal Charities, the kind of who we are. We talk a little bit about COVID response work, lay out expectations, policies, procedures, all of that. And then we get into this volunteering and context piece, which is where does your organization and the work that volunteers do sit in this larger ecosystem of social issues, right? What are the systemic issues and things in your community that are making the work that you're doing necessary? And then we end with next steps and questions. All right. So, intro to Episcopal Charities, intro to who you are at your organization. I frame this in ours through our mission and vision. In terms of our mission is what we want to do, and our vision is how we see ourselves doing that, right? And when you're doing this, you can really bring your mission to life and talk about the ways that the work that you do and the really unique ways that you do it specifically at your organization. What does that say about your community and this community that you're asking folks to be a part of? All of you have these incredible stories and incredible, beautiful communities that people should want to be a part of. And it's just a matter of how to communicate those messages, right? And a question to kind of keep in the back of your mind here is what are things about our mission and vision that I can share with folks that they couldn't read in a handbook or they couldn't look at our website and see? What kinds of like nuances to this can you share? So like, for example, our mission statement that you can see here is Episcopal Charities transforming the lives of those in need. But when I get to this point in my volunteer orientation, I talk about the ways that it's really cool that our volunteer program sort of pushes the bounds of that statement in that we're all in need, we've all been in need, and we all are also transformed through the service work that we do, in addition to the transformative work that we do for our neighbors. Because that's how I think about volunteering. That's how we think about it at Episcopal Charities. And so it's a matter of sort of translating our mission statement to get volunteers to think that way, right? And then I sort of delve into an overview of our impact, what we do. And this is clearly very basic on the slide, but when I'm talking, you really want to like use numbers and be specific, tell specific stories about specific people that you're working with. And again, really bring this, this image of the work that you all are doing to life. And again, coming back to how does the volunteer support that your program offers impact the programs and the offerings of your organization? Depending on how you structure this and the structure of your program, this might be a time to give an overview of the kinds of opportunities that are available for folks to volunteer at. This might be a great time to have some testimonials or to have some volunteer leaders that you work with to talk about their experience and sort of get another kind of leadership face in front of folks is really impactful as well. And again, as I said before, I try to be aware when we're working with new volunteers that the pandemic has been, and really, this whole last year and a half has been this incredibly intense time for everyone. And you've probably heard Patrick and I talk about it as a catalyst in a lot of ways. And I think that's definitely true of volunteerism as well, that folks have seen this really hard year and want to get involved and help. And so I think it's really powerful and important to talk about what we're doing in COVID, right, in this moment, right? And so that's why I like to start with that quarantine MVP icebreaker and come back to it at this point too. And you all should too, because you have all done some just astounding, incredible work during the pandemic. And this is the time to show that off and to tell your volunteers about it. So again, looking at specifics, how have your numbers changed? How has your operations changed? And what was it like to do that? What was it like to move from a choice pantry to pre-packed grab and go bags, or to move a virtual kids program, summer camp online? I think doing that is a really sort of powerful peek behind the curtain for folks that people will really appreciate in this moment. And in this section, I sort of talk about our volunteer program specifically and what that looks like. What does it mean to be a volunteer at Episcopal Charities? And for you, like, are there other events that volunteers can attend? Other ways that they can get involved? Are there leadership opportunities for volunteers? Or do you have a particular need for volunteers with a certain skill? This might be a place to list those. So here we have with Episcopal Charities that we do individual and group volunteer work. We do our Consultant Corps program, which is our professional skills-based volunteers, these education pieces for volunteers, and resources for volunteer programs. So really kind of laying out what does our engagement with volunteers look like. And for each of these questions, again, why? The opportunity to tie the volunteer work to the mission and to lay out onto the table all of the ways that volunteers can get involved with you. And then we kind of start digging into procedures, policies, expectations stuff. And again, this is what can you explain to them that they can't read in a manual or on your website. And so I do this at Episcopal Charities from kind of a larger scale and then move down. So this is sort of our broadest scale where I'm saying our volunteer program.
Hello.
Hello? I'll keep going. Our volunteer program works, it's program driven in the sense that programs tell me where the volunteer needs are so that folks know that those opportunities are really coming out of the community. They're varied in that we have a wide range of things that folks can do, and individualized in that I work individually with volunteers. And then you want to talk about the onboarding process. Where are volunteers in that process right now at this moment when you're talking to them, and what's happening next? So for us, we have our application and the orientation session, which would be this time. And then volunteers sign a digital volunteer agreement, which is also in the resources on Dropbox for today's session, if you want to take a look at that. And then on an ongoing basis, they look for opportunities and serve. And along those lines, you also want to make sure that volunteers know how they sign up or get plugged in to serve with you. Do they sign up through your website? Is there a newsletter they need to sign up for? Is there someone they're supposed to email by a certain time? Those sorts of finding additional opportunities and keeping people engaged beyond what they might be coming into your door for this first time. And along those lines also, what should volunteers expect from you in terms of communications? Do you have a newsletter? Should they be checking social media? How do they stay connected with you? Let me pause there for questions. This is the question slide that I have built into the orientation, because if I don't, I will blow through it. So let me take this moment to pause as well. Sweet, I will keep rolling. Okay. So then I get into expectations here, and this is really sort of an overview of how things work. What are the specific sort of baseline expectations for volunteers? What are the things that I want them to do or not do every time that they work with us? And something to consider here is, in terms of structuring this, do you have different groups of expectations for different people? So for example, I have a slide here for expectations for our volunteers when they're working with programs, but I also have expectations when working with guests and students, and those are slightly different. And so you might consider, are there different expectations for your volunteers in terms of interacting with your program staff or with other volunteers or your guests? And especially with youth programs, what are the rules around interacting safely with kids? And something I would highlight here too is that COVID safety is a really big one that should be in this section, which will vary for everyone in terms of what your policies and procedures are, but I think it's still important to be naming what those kind of baseline expectations are, so that we're acknowledging that there is a risk, volunteers are taking on a risk, and that you're aware of it and policies are in place to manage that. Also, in this section, you would do your safe church or sexual misconduct prevention policies. If you refer back to our Sustainability Institute about Safe Church, which was a couple of months ago, maybe in February, it's posted on our website. That gets into more of the specifics of what you need for this policy, but in terms of orientation, this is the time where you share with volunteers that you do have a sexual misconduct prevention policy in place, a general overview of what that is and where they can find more specifics if they need it, and that someone on site will be enforcing that and who that is. And then, of course, also is the sort of less fun part, which is where you tell folks what they're not allowed to do. And this, again, is important in setting expectations for volunteers' behavior and conduct, but it's also just a good sort of best practice thing to have in place so that your volunteers know that this is something that you take seriously and that matters to you, right? So I post our code of conduct here and tell new volunteers that these are the prohibited behaviors when volunteering with us. And these are things like discriminatory or offensive behavior, sexual harassment, use of substances, for those of you who are on the phone and not looking at the slides here. And these are also listed in the volunteer agreement that I mentioned before that's on the Dropbox. So volunteers also sign and return a copy of this to me to let me know that they are agreeing to this. And also important in this is letting folks know what the consequences are for violating the policy so that that's clear as well. And also along those lines, I like to tell our volunteers the sort of chain of command of who they talk to when something happens that makes them feel concerned, or they just have a question that they want to talk about. So being really clear about who the faces that they should know are and who they should talk to when, and providing that information is really key. All right. So then we get into my favorite part, which is talking about volunteering in a larger context. So like I said, sort of at the top, a successful volunteer orientation will kind of hit on the context that your work and your volunteer work sits in. So touching on what the structural issues and isms are that are at play in your community that make the work that you're doing necessary. And there's a lot of power in naming those. So for example, in this PowerPoint, we talk a little bit about food insecurity, and I spend some time talking about the issue of food insecurity with new volunteers, but that also, opens up the discussion to talk about ways that food insecurity intersects with issues of immigration and housing access and systemic racism and gender issues and all of these things. And having these kind of open discussions with volunteers has been really fruitful. So I really love, I'm sure you're familiar with the 2 feet of social justice image. This is a Catholic social justice teaching that I sort of use as a frame for this conversation with volunteers, where I'll say that we know that on the 1 foot, so to speak, that charity, or if you don't like that language, service work is really important and is the work that volunteers do. It's the work that you all do in your day-to-day work in your programs too. But that keeping in mind this other foot of the social justice and broader context in mind is important for seeing the whole picture. And these conversations can be tricky sometimes, right? And people come from a variety of backgrounds and levels of familiarity with your work and with the issues that pertain to your work, right? So my rule of thumb is to not assume that anyone does or doesn't know something and to ask, which seems obvious, but is a great way to get people to participate and to open up the conversation. And so I use this slide to kind of do some term defining at the beginning and to give volunteers some vocabulary to work with as we're continuing to talk about this. So I'll just put this slide up and say, okay, who knows what the difference between hunger and food insecurity is? And we just spend some time discussing. And then I like to say, sorry, I'm losing my place. Here we are. Then we'll talk about why does food insecurity exist? And I'll tend to ask the question before I even go to this slide and have the conversation first. And again, this is something that you can do differently depending on the format and the size. If you have a big group, it could be great to do some breakout group discussions around this. Or if you're in person, I've done it with the huge Post-its on the wall and running around the room and writing and all of the things. There are lots of ways to do this, but I think the important thing is the wrestling in community with these issues. So like I say, I tend to ask the question first and we talk, and then I'll switch to this slide and go through so that we hit these main points about why these issues exist, the things that I really want volunteers to know. And who specifically is impacted, really like naming the populations of folks that are impacted by these issues and how that might connect with what they might see when they're volunteering. I won't get into this in super detail. This is a graphic from Feeding America, and it's pre-COVID. This is from like 2014, a survey that they did where they basically asked families all over the United States about choices that they had to make in terms of how they were using their resources for buying food or having to choose to use their funds otherwise. So I think this is a really just powerful graphic. It's pretty impactful. So if you want to steal it, it's available. And then finally, again, we know that this time of the pandemic has been crazy and that all of these issues and systems of inequality have really been magnified by the pandemic. We talk about this all the time. But your volunteers might not have had the same experiences and might not have seen that. So I think it's worth talking about the impact specifically about COVID on these issues as well. Again, keeps people up to date and communicates to them that volunteer support is going to be so helpful in moving us forward beyond this pandemic. And finally, I write out the conclusions that I hope volunteers are coming to, or at least, questions that I hope they're continuing to ask themselves moving forward from this conversation. So making explicit, experiencing food insecurity is not a matter of bad luck or bad choices, that there are all of these systems and structures in place that interact with each other and compound one another beyond the realm of control of a single individual, right? And to say that this is the work that we continue to do together, that we serve together, we volunteer and work to meet the immediate needs of our community, but we also work together to learn more about the issues and to talk with one another about what we're seeing and what we're learning. And then finally, always circle back to the next steps and a reminder of where they're going next. So what the process is, who they should expect to hear from, or what they need to do next to get going and to get working with you all. And I like to use my thank you slide to show folks where they can stay connected with us, again, to provide our contact information. And I always share these with volunteers so that they have all of that. So that is, let me pause there. Those are my Episcopal Charities volunteer orientation slides. And I know that not everything is applicable to everyone in this room, and that there's a lot of us doing lots of different things in this room. So let me just kind of pause for any comments or reactions or questions from the group here.
SK, I just have one.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really helpful for us to understand that volunteer orientation doesn't just happen one time.
Yes.
Like that it is very, very appropriate to bring in all of your volunteers once a year for an all volunteer meeting and meeting these same guidelines and these same kinds of objectives to walk through an issue like education or food insecurity or what the impact of the pandemic has been on your kind of program or in your area. I think it's also helpful to think about your orientation. You are going to have to reorient a lot of volunteers, right? Because in the world of the pandemic, so many of your volunteers had to step away, and so they've been out of your program for a year. You have new processes. You have a new culture that you are bringing. So don't think of your orientation as just a one-time event. You can do multiple events. You have multiple opportunities to kind of orient your volunteers and your people to creating a culture. This is how you develop culture, like the culture of your program. So much of that is found in this foundation, in what SK is doing with you right now, is setting, this is who we are. And so you don't do that foundation work just once 3 years ago when they started. You have some kind of regular formation where you're hitting these kinds of things, especially right now with COVID, as we're moving into this next phase of COVID. This is a moment to look and reorient, right? Which way are we going? All of your volunteers and those key people in your program. So don't think of this just as a one-off. Great, now all of our volunteers have gone through the orientation, check, 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 check.
Yes.
As kind of a conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, I've seen folks sometimes will do like an orientation one day and then a refresher the next day for veteran volunteers to come back. And I think those are great just opportunities to get people together, hanging out and talking beyond being at the pantry volunteering or whatever the case may be, right? So that actually leads me really nicely, thank you, Patrick, to a brief note about retention and appreciation that I just wanted to make to close us out a little bit here. I hope you're seeing kind of underlying here, as Patrick was just saying, that orientation and how we think about orientation is the way that we develop this culture where volunteers are acknowledged and valued for the work that they're doing. And one of that is one of the most important factors in retaining volunteers, as I've said. So again, yes, how are you continuing to do this when your orientation is over? How are you keeping volunteers informed about the changing landscape or your changing strategies at your program or upcoming opportunities or other things they can do to plug in? And just as I was saying, and then of course did that exact thing, that we build in question slides to not blow through them. How are you building in opportunities just day to day for volunteers to share questions and comments with you? I think continuing to kind of solicit and ask for and use and value volunteer feedback is really important, because that is a great resource that's just available.
I was going to take it over to him.
And finally, we talked a lot about this on our Fundraising Sustainability Institute last month. But I think it's really appropriate here too to talk about how important it is to express gratitude to folks. People really love to be seen and acknowledged for the work that they're doing, and volunteers are the top of that list, right? So April actually is Volunteer Appreciation Month. So you still have, a day and a bit to squeeze in some thank you notes if you'd like to. This picture here is a postcard that we sent to our volunteers, but it also doesn't have to be a formal thing like that, right? To create this culture of appreciation. I think that we should have conversations about how we can do creative and fun volunteer appreciation events and all of those good extra things. But for now, I think it's just important to continue to say thank you to people. And I think that is all I have PowerPoint wise. And have any questions or other comments kind of come up here? Jeanette.
Hi. Just not to be negative in any way, but sometimes you get a volunteer who just doesn't fit in. Not somebody who does something terrible that you have to tell them, sorry, you can't come anymore, but either just doesn't get it or, I don't know. How do you deal with that? That's, difficult.
Yeah. Does anyone, let me open this up to everyone before I comment. Does anyone have any strategies or have experience with this kind of issue? Vanessa.
Hey,
Hi.
I'm still driving. I've had that issue in the past, and I very gently just pull them over to the side. First, you want to make sure that everything is okay at home. Secondly, I ask them how they like the experience, and pretty much their face will tell whether they liked it or they didn't. And I just easily say, hey, there's no worries. If this is something that you thought was different than what you signed up for and you feel the need to leave, we have no problem with that, but maybe we could try to find something else for you. And if they admitted to the fact that it's really not a good fit, I always direct them to New York Cares and tell them that there's a million things on the New York Cares website to do. If I feel that they're not doing a proper job, I mean, we have to keep the job done and we have to keep the atmosphere good for everybody. So if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, again, you just have to suck it up and pull them to the side and say, this is what is expected. And unfortunately, you're not meeting the expectation. Is there anything I can help you with? And then in that respect, sometimes they take their own out and say, you know what, you're right, it's not for me. And everybody leaves amicably.
Yeah, thanks for that, Vanessa. That's really helpful. And I think too, like there are times it's a balance too, right? Because we want people to feel welcome and we want them to be involved in our communities, but also like you've got a lot of things to do, Jeanette, other than like inventing jobs for someone to do. But I think there are times where that can be sort of a leadership opportunity for that person to have sort of an individual activity that they're kind of responsible for, maybe away from the group. And I would just also echo what Vanessa said about New York Cares, and you can send those volunteers to me too. I'll find something for them.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
If I may, this is Joyce from Sloatsburg. Hi, everybody.
Hey, Joyce.
Can I just ask, what kind of other retention ideas have people done? Have you guys done any? We got the postcard SK shared with us. Are there other things that folks have done that they've found are just, welcome, your volunteers really appreciate? I know I try and write, I write a note, it's an email, but I write an email every month to the volunteers to just say, this is what we've done this month. This is what we're doing next month, the dates, and just a little recap, maybe a photo or something. But I'm really curious to see what other folks have done.
Vanessa, I see your hand.
Yeah, what I did was I wish I was at my desk to show you. I created certificates of appreciation. I used the St. John the Divine letterhead logo, and we put that they've been a friend to the community since a specific date. We put their name. I bought frames for them, and we tend to give them out to everybody that donates really large, but we've also give them out to the volunteers as well. Once we know that there's some staying power and they're really into it, because, these frames are expensive. And, in this respect, they really like it and they appreciate it. I'm going to hang it up at my desk at work. You guys treat me better than my own my own job does, which is another thing.
Yeah.
Treat them better than what they get treated at work, and they'll come and they'll volunteer even harder.
That's great. Thanks, Vanessa. And I think
I don't know how to put my hand up, but
you're good. Go
every
ahead.
year at Christmas, I write everybody a Christmas card, and I give them a $10 gift card to Dunkin' Donuts for everybody. And then at Easter time, I plant little pansies and I write them just a little card. Thank you so much. And I give them a little pansy that cost me about 30 cents. And that's what I do for volunteer appreciation. And back in the day, we would have a picnic lunch where everyone would bring something and we would share.
Yes, I was just going to bring that up as something that you
we
may
haven't done
be
that in a
starting
couple
to start thinking about again, of perhaps of outdoor events that you might do maybe over the summer for volunteers, or even in the fall as kind of a kickoff back to the new year. Patrick, did you want to jump in?
And I think it's really important that whatever your recognition is, that you tie it back to your mission.
Mhm.
So the example of a feeding program having a picnic. So having food insecurity, having food at the center of your appreciation for a program in food insecurity. If it's education, then maybe it's a book that's been really interesting that you're going to give to your volunteers as something that's connected to what you're doing. You don't want to like burden your volunteers with like a new task, but for instance, if you have been doing a lot in food insecurity, then maybe it's a short book or an article that you're going to print out just as a way of saying, hey, this was really interesting and this is why you are so important right now. So by sending, I put in the chat some research from Feeding America, and they've got great like two pagers on what COVID is doing in 2020 and 2021. So if you had like a volunteer newsletter or you were doing an email blast about, okay, remember to sign up. Hey, here's a really interesting article about what the pandemic is doing to food insecurity in rural communities, in urban communities. It'd be interesting to talk to anybody about this over the next couple of weeks when you come in, right? And so what you're doing is you're doing some education, but you're inviting them in. Again, SK uses the language of like kind of peeking behind the curtain, right? Seeing why are we doing this? When you start transitioning back to more choice, you're gonna wanna ask the question, well, why are we going back to choice? That's so much more work for us.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what about like a 1 or 2 page article that talks about the dignity of choice? And actually, if we look at the dollars and cents of choice, it's actually a better deal because the food waste skyrockets when you don't have any choice, right? So in volunteer retention, it's about invitation. It's inviting volunteers in and giving them some greater sense of ownership. So like sending that note. And I'm telling you what, when the pandemic started, the first thing I grabbed from my office, I have a box of stationery here. There is nothing like a postcard size note that's written in your own hand. It goes far. So those are my 2 cents on retention. I think education is huge. Whatever you can do for education and whatever you're gonna do for retention to connect it to your mission, and handwritten notes, I think are great.
Yeah, thank you. Those are excellent suggestions. Any other comments about retention, other questions to pose to the group here? Vanessa.
Hold it, I made it home. Woohoo! So just going back to the giving thanks to the volunteers. I found this online and I'll email it to you if you'd like. And I print them out. And it's a really cute little 8x8. And it says, volunteering is the ultimate exercise in democracy. You vote in elections once a year, but when you volunteer, you vote every day about the kinds of community you want to live in. So I will email it to you,
Please do.
and then you can pass it around to the group. And I print them out at CVS or Walgreens. It's like 50 cents or whatever.
Do you have those like posted on site?
I have them posted on site, and then I also give them away as well to the people that see it. So I always have a good stack of them. I print it off, like I said, is CVS or Walgreens, and it's just a couple of cents.
I love that. That's a great quote to like come back to and to recenter things on too. That's really awesome.
Yep. No worries.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for all of these fabulous ideas and resources. As always, I'm really, really grateful for them, and I'm happy to share anything with the group that I can. So if you come across any volunteer-related item that you think folks might like to see as well, please send that my way, and I'll share that around with the group. And I just have a couple of quick announcements and things to close us out, and then I maybe will even give you a couple of minutes back. So first of all, since we are on the topic of volunteers and resources for volunteers, I'm going to take advantage of this moment where I have you all to do a quick sales pitch for Volunteer Hub, which is the volunteer management system that Episcopal Charities we purchased last summer. And I have been working with programs to set up individual sites for your organizations and programs, and working with your leadership to train you on how to kind of run the administrative side of things with Volunteer Hub. So I think Patrick has dropped, thank you, the link to our homepage, the Episcopal Charities Volunteer Hub homepage. So you can kind of see what it sort of looks like. All of our opportunities populate there. And then I work with programs individually to have individual sites with just your things for just your volunteers. I think it's a really awesome tool and is pretty easy to use. I'm looking around, there are a couple of folks on this call who use it. And it does end up taking some of the like time consuming, annoying parts of dealing with volunteers. It automates them and does it for you. So you have all the time in the world to plan your volunteer orientation, right? So I love Volunteer Hub. I think it's a really great tool for, again, like for capacity, for what you're doing, but also it generates really great reports so that you can talk about the things that your volunteers are doing in really specific ways. So that's my pitch. If you're interested in talking about how we might work with that at your program, please send me an email. I'd love to jump on Zoom and talk about how we might do that.
SK, I don't know if you mentioned
yes.
this. How much are we charging programs to use this software?
Thank you. Nothing. It's free for you. Thank you. Yes.
And you all have control of it. Like you all, like, I know every one of you, like, managing volunteer schedules takes so much time. Like, I know. And everyone's got their own system. And if you got a system that you love, that your volunteers love, that works for you, fabulous. If you are looking for something that will just give yourself a little bit of breathing room, this is fantastic. SK has set this thing up. Our board has paid for it and said, any of our programs that want to use it, we'll create their own site for them and they can manage it. And I will say the upshot for us is we get to see the data behind it, just in the context of like how many hours are being used, all that kind of, or how many volunteers are volunteering at different programs. So we're not like in your business, but we do see some of the back end kind of metadata. But this is, I think it's so important. The other piece on volunteer retention is that it's easy for volunteers to volunteer, that it's dependable, that they're being communicated to. Volunteer Hub helps you do all of those things. It helps you communicate. It helps people sign up and know that they have a spot. And if they can't sign up, then that's not the spot for, like it's all taken care of.
Mhm.
So you would spend some time in setting it up with SK. We'll kind of help give you some support as you're launching this out. It takes a little bit of work on the front end, but I'm telling you, the back end payout is huge. So that's my pitch for volunteer.
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, so please do shoot me an email so we can talk more about that. And then another pitch for our next Sustainability Institute, which is it's in May 27th, also a Thursday at 4 p.m. And that one will be about managing program operations. So that is on the website if you would like to register for that call. And we have some other Sustainability Institutes in the works for the near future. We're looking at one around SNAP and benefits enrollment, and one around housing court and eviction prevention work, and one around food pantry sort of operations specifically. And I just throw those out there to let you know those are the topics that we're kind of thinking of. And as always, if there are topics that you would like for us to cover in a Sustainability Institute, please let us know so that we can make these workshops as useful and beneficial to you all as we can. And I think with that, we can close it out with 1 whole minute. Back to you. Thank you all so much for being here. It was great to talk with you, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you, bye.
See everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Stay dry. It's raining out.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.